Today marks the third day in a row, or the third class meeting in a row, in which we have a guest who is in one way or another connected to the engineering program here at Northeastern. That won't be the case for all of our guests, but we are extremely fortunate to have an incredibly accomplished member of Northeastern's own faculty. Dr. Matthias Ruth is the interim director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern and serves as the founding director of Northeastern's Resilient Cities Laboratory and its Urban Informatics program. Professor Ruth holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Heidelberg, Germany, and a PhD in geography from the University of Illinois, where he also received training in engineering and biology. After almost a decade at Boston University and more than a decade at the University of Maryland, where he was the Roy F. Weston Chair in Natural Economics and Policy Advisor on Sustainability to the Chancellor, he joined Northeastern University in 2012. Professor Ruth's research focus on dynamic modeling of natural resource use, industrial and infrastructure systems and analysis, and environmental economics and policy. His theoretical work heavily draws on the concepts from engineering, economics, and ecology, while his applied research utilizes methods of nonlinear dynamic modeling as well as adaptive and anticipatory management. Applications of his work cover the full spectrum from local to regional, to national and global environmental challenges, as well as the investment and policy opportunities these challenges present. Professor Ruth has published 14 books and over 120 papers and book chapters in the scientific literature. Please join me in welcoming Matthias Ruth.
Thanks so much. I'll just forward here.
Yeah, it's the first line's already.
All right, good morning, everyone. It's really great. Thanks, George, for the wonderful introductions. What I want to do with you over the next 20 minutes is talk a little bit about climate change challenges. All of you, no doubt, have heard about climate change as a major problem that humanity faces. And I want to approach this sort of from, obviously, in the context of this course, from a design perspective. You know, how do we conceptualize the challenges that lie ahead, and then how do we deal with them? And so, following strict instructions I've been given to first emphasize and define, ideate, develop prototypes and test, but also I want to very specifically pull out here the notion of implementation, which is really something that's very much at the heart of policy work. And want to give you a bit of a background on the climate change topic in general. It takes us just a couple of minutes. We can do this fairly quickly. Talk a little bit also about the big policy challenges that lie ahead, at least as they have been defined so far. And then talk a little bit more specifically about long-term challenges and how to address those. So that's the first few minutes here before we'll move on. Climate change. Oftentimes referred to also as global warming. We know it's much more than that. I have two charts here. Both of those really try to tell the same story over different time frames. The top lines are for the global temperature averages over the last 140 years, and the horizontal line that you see is the average of temperatures across the globe between 1961 and 1990. That's sort of used as a benchmark. And then you'll see on the left-hand side of the top graph that most of the temperatures historically lay below that average. And in recent years, globally, temperatures have started to increase significantly. We have much better record in the northern hemisphere and real good data and observations that extend back actually over 1,000 years. Sometimes these are measurements of temperatures in the oceans by ships during the colonial period, where the shipping companies measured where they were, what they did, and what the temperatures of the oceans were and such. So one can collect that, or one can go even further back and drill cores in ice in the Arctic or Antarctic and find trace elements that then you can relate to the global temperature. Again, that second chart on the bottom shows you relatively constant temperatures over a long period of time, and in the last few years it accelerates significantly, that temperature increase. So that the last 12 years have shown 10 out of those 12 to be the hottest on record. So this is something that's of serious concern. And what causes that climate change? To a very large extent, it's the burning of fossil fuels and the emission of other so-called greenhouse gases that then accumulate in the atmosphere, and many of these greenhouse gases have a mean residence time of upward of 100 years. So the stuff out there is there for a long period of time, takes a long time to be absorbed back by the ecosystems and by the oceans, and basically while it's out there in the atmosphere, functions like a heat shield, if you wish, where heat gets trapped inside the atmosphere and closer to the globe. So that's a big challenge, and so in the last 30 or so years, people have become increasingly concerned about this and wondered, what they should be doing. And of course, one of the first strategies is to cut down on those greenhouse gases, right? And many of you might have heard of different strategies to do this from the policy perspective. There are these international climate negotiations we regularly hear about, the Kyoto Protocol and many others that have been put in place that then spell out how much emission increase is actually allowed and how much emission reduction is required from individual countries. As they do this, it actually affects their economies because in many ways, so the argument, they need to cut down on energy use, which then raises the cost of production, which then reduces their competitiveness. And so very soon, when you try from a global perspective to talk about climate policy, very soon do you get into then trade regimes, how do you balance some of these costs that are imposed on individual countries, but also within countries like the United States and many European countries, for example, we're trying to figure out how to cut our carbon emissions. So we're slowly now talking about national energy and climate policies. At the state and regional level, there are actually already some in place. Most states in the United States have a climate action plan of one form or another. In the Northeast, we have 10 states that came together and have developed the first carbon trading scheme to control the emission of carbon dioxide, and I actually was involved with some of my research in helping create that. Local government action at the city level, at the community level, at the church level, at the school level. This university has its own climate action plan, and then all the way down to figuring out what it means for households and firms. So all of this is really happening and has been happening in the last 30 years. It's not something I'm going to do. All right, so we're going to do actually something totally different. This, and I tell you, I got bored of. And a lot of other people got bored of because it seems to be just the same old story over and over again. Yes, emitting carbon and other greenhouse gases is the root cause and needs to be addressed. No one denies this in sort of that community. However, and this is sort of the eye-opening chart that helped me rethink and empathize, what the real issues are in the near term that we need to deal with. And I know it's a little convoluted. So if you look, and it's a schematic really. So if you look in the lower line where it says CO2 emissions, if we were able to actually implement all these strategies that we currently have in place and cut down our carbon emissions to near zero in the near-term future, because of the long mean residence time of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it would still take about 100 or so years for the CO2 to stabilize. There's all the processes that we've already kicked in place that still mean for 100 plus years, we will see a rise in CO2 concentrations, and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. As that happens, it means that over several centuries, the temperature will still continue to increase. And because the oceans expand as temperatures increase and the glaciers melt as temperatures increase, we will have probably upward of 1,000 years worth of climate change to which we already committed ourselves. I would like to think that that's a little bit of a problem. Okay? It's a problem for policy, it's a problem for engineering, it's a problem for our economy, it's a problem for our lifestyles and so on. And it's not just a problem for us, but it's really a problem globally. It's not just us who can afford to try to figure out different ways of doing things, but it's also affecting people all around the globe. And so I want to more carefully define what it means to have that climate change challenge looming out there. In many ways, it's already unfolding. So I want to talk a little bit about climate adaptation as part of this defining the problem exercise here, and then about regional planning. And there very specifically, I want to just share with you a case study I've been involved in the last 5 years from Europe, from northern Germany. So one of the key motivations behind figuring out what to do about climate change, not just from the emissions but from the adaptation side, is the fact that sea levels continue to rise. Extreme weather events, now that we've sort of messed with the heat balances in the atmosphere, extreme weather events will become increasingly frequent and severe. Droughts, snowstorms, ice storms, heat waves, all of this can happen, has happened in the past, but will happen more frequently, more intensely, and more erratically. And so things will get significantly worse before they get better, sorry to tell you. Has implications on shipping routes, it has implications on public health, it has implications on the spreads of diseases, on agricultural productivity, and on and on. So it actually affects every individual aspect of your life, of mine, and of those still to come, and people all around the globe. And talking about those around the globe, well, there are some places that face those challenges, all while they are also trying to very rapidly develop their economies. Skyscrapers in Beijing being put up one after the other almost on a weekly basis. Air conditioning being proliferated all across these areas where you have high temperatures, especially during the summer months. And just think about it. Things get hot in an urban environment, so everyone puts these window air conditioners on, you need more energy, you spew out more pollutants, and you spew out the heat back into the urban environment, which then actually means that whoever doesn't have an air conditioner yet needs to buy one as well, and all of those who got it already will crank it up a bit. So we often find ourselves in these what's called positive feedback, these spiraling dynamics. And then there are people who don't even have the necessity. They don't have the water that they need, the food that they need, the healthcare provision that they need, or they got bad air. So really, it's the climate change challenge, the need to cut the emissions, all while trying to raise the profiles and the living standards of people around the globe. So those are the big challenges. And I only have 15 minutes, so I can solve them all for the remaining 15 minutes, but I want to share with you how we are trying to resolve some of these challenges in one small context. And so this is a project I've been heavily involved in for the last 5 years in northern Germany. So on the left-hand side, you see the map of Germany. So north of it is Denmark, south of it is France and Switzerland, and then this is a piece that's sort of tucked away near the North Sea. And then on the right-hand side, you see a little higher resolution of this. This is a region that's highly dynamic. It's actually not all that dissimilar to Massachusetts or other parts of the Northeast, where you have a lot of high tech, you have top-notch universities, you have a lot of agriculture, you have a lot of forestry, so it's a very diverse economy. And so what I want to share with you here is how we've tried to approach the identification of strategies that help reduce vulnerability to climate change so that we are better adapted to it and so that we can roll out, as climate changes, new strategies that make us less vulnerable. So a little bit about the approach. Very specifically, I do a lot of computer simulation modeling, so I show you a little bit about how we do this, but then also present to you the various roles that the stakeholders have played in this and what came out of it. So the region, as I already indicated, lots of nature, if you wish, out there, lots of high tech, lots of highly intensive agriculture. I'll never forget the day I visited a pig farm with 15,000 pigs. You can just imagine, actually it smells as clean as it smells in here because they cannot afford to have a single pig do anything that affects the health and the quality of the meat and so on of the others. So it's high tech all around, and it's also, because it's on the globe, a hub for supply chains nationally and internationally, major shipping routes from Bremen and Hamburg to the rest of the world, sort of like Boston and New York. What we've tried to do is draw expertise from all of these sectors in the economy and society to develop an adaptation plan for this large region in the northwest of Germany, and to do this in a way that it's really informed by the needs and the challenges that these stakeholders see, that it's guided by the cutting-edge research that we have on climate science, on infrastructure development, land use, and so on. But it's not just research, it's action motivated, so that we at the end don't just have a report that accumulates dust on some minister's shelf and my mom's, but that actually people out there read the stuff and follow through on it and learn and extract lessons that they actually then ultimately implement. And that we don't do this piece by piece, that we say, oh, we'll deal with the harbors, and we'll deal with the ecosystems, and we'll deal with all of them separately. No, they're all interconnected, right? And so try to do this from a systems perspective was the big challenge. And so here's one way to conceptualize this. And this is clearly what will be on one of your next homework assignment. No, I'm kidding. So this is something, I just want to sort of touch at some of the main elements. So on the top, you see sort of a yellow bar that cuts across, and this is a set of modules, if you wish, that describe how climate may unfold in the region under different conditions. So this is something about the frequency of the heat waves, about the droughts, about the winter storms, and so on. On the bottom, you see another part that's sort of exogenous to the region. These are the large-term dynamics associated with demographic change, with economic change, global economic change, and so on. All of those sort of come together to affect what's happening in the middle piece, which is the socioeconomics and the climate manifestations, if you wish, of that particular region. And then in there, we've modeled very specifically things like the needs for housing and how housing stock turns over, what that means for the energy consumption of those households also as their incomes change, what that all means for the requirements for new land to develop so that you can put these houses, the people in those places, what it means for their jobs and the employment, and then how that sort of all feeds back to create new demand for housing and other goods and services, what that all means for agricultural products and what it means for energy consumption and emissions and on and on. So we have this, think of it like SimCity hits the real world, computer simulation tool that captures all, or as many as we could, feedback processes that describe what's happening inside the region. And then we can take this tool and spin out different what-if scenarios, and we can actually give it to people and say, hey, you, instead of implementing the policy in the real world and then 10 years later know what the impacts are, you can take this tool and sort of, like a flight simulator, train your piloting skills and then get knowledge from that. And once you have that knowledge, then go out and implement the policy. That was sort of the ultimate goal. And of course, the world around us is changing in so many ways that we don't really know exactly what we are preparing for. And so we have convened these stakeholders from all walks of life, private citizens, policy decision makers, representatives from companies and so on, and brought them together and said, let's think about consistent ways in which the world can unfold. And one of those is what we call the world of regions. So, and I'll go through this table very quickly. So the world of regions was one way of thinking about how immigration, climate change, and power outages and all this, how that evolves if we're thinking about this Northwest region as separate from all of the other regions. If we're really trying to focus to make this by itself work, what are the implications of this? And we can describe this sort of as the boundary constraints, or as the other extremes we could think of globalization without limits, where the region really doesn't matter and you can buy and sell what you want, but then you make yourself reliant on what's happening outside. And so trying to articulate what these different worldviews are was a big challenge. But then those are the boundary constraints under which the model runs. And then the model itself, is a computer model with a user interface, and we don't need to go through any of these details, but this is what the user would get. It's like a dashboard, if you wish, where they could choose, for example, in which months, in which county, to build what kind of power plant that uses what particular fuel with what emissions profile, at what capacity, and so on. And we've modeled all the power plants that already exist. We know roughly, with some randomness in there, when they get shut down for various reasons, because they're too old or because the technology changes and so on. So there's all of this happening inside this engine, and now you're sitting there at this dashboard and you can every month can decide what to do, where, and then you see as an output what it means with regard to your land use, for example, what it means with regard to your emissions profiles, what does it mean with regard to the expenditures that you have to pay for the energy that you're buying, and many, many other of these performance criteria. And so these stakeholders played with this every month or so, looked at it and say, oh, there's a problem in this county, or oops, suddenly there's a heat wave we didn't anticipate, now we have no more biofuel to feed the biogenerators that we've just put online in order to make up for the energy that we lose by having switched off a power plant that uses nuclear fuels or coal. So it becomes fairly quickly very, very complicated. But then if you play this out with them more and more often, they gain experience in how all of these things interrelate with each other. And then through that, are able to pinpoint various intervention mechanisms, not just in the individual counties, but also through time, that help make the region more resilient to some of these unknown and unknowable climate and other dynamics that come to the region from the outside. Just as one sort of closing summary slide on that particular project, what we then get is sort of summary profiles for what the region looks like. If you look just at the top chart, you see the red wiggly curve at the top, and this is the energy demand profile under a particular scenario, and it embeds the fact that there is the odd heat wave where you need more air conditioning or whatever. And it fluctuates because this is all on a monthly basis, and you don't need as much heat during the winter, and you don't need as much cooling during the summer under some conditions and so on. And then the bars underneath are the shares of each of the energy carriers that make up together to meet that demand. And in some cases you have a surplus and you can ship it off, assuming you're sort of in a more regionally integrated environment. And towards the later years, whatever we actually tried to do under the set of scenarios, we were never ever able to meet our energy demand. So there's a shortfall. And as a matter of fact, if you did something like this on surrounding regions, you might also find the same, right? So then you go back and say, well, what should we have done in early years so that later on we don't get to that problem? The real challenge is climate change unfolds, and so the heat waves become more severe, the winter storms become more severe, and what we've identified is it's almost impossible under some of these conditions to be prepared given the current technology. So one of the spin-off projects actually was the development and ultimately patenting of alternative biofuel technologies that are much more efficient, that now the region is actually trying to roll out. In closing, okay, so I lumped together this ideate prototyping and testing, sort of where we really do this all on the computer, but now we are actually implementing. So on the basis of these simulation exercises and the knowledge that was generated among the stakeholders and the researchers, we learned a lot from them, we are now in the process of actually implementing technologies, regional plans, energy policies, you name it, for that region as a whole. And this is going to be another 5+ years of experimenting, if you wish, and observing what's out there. One thing that we've learned early on, dealing with the stakeholders, when we said, hey, ultimately we want to roll this out, that everyone was looking for, call it the silver bullet, the one thing that helps them get to where they need to be by 2020 or 2050. And in this process, what they've learned is what they actually need is a silver buckshot, right? You've got to do a little here and a little there, and they all need to be sort of synced up with each other, right? And then that's really obviously much more difficult to do because the water managers are in charge of water, not of electricity. But if there is no water to cool the power plant, then the power plant people have a challenge, right? And so figuring out how they all interrelate, that was the real challenge. And now as they begin to build on these lessons and roll out the pieces of advice that we've generated from these simulations, and as we develop and deploy some of these new technologies, the thing then we're doing is monitoring how well, not just do they have learned from these exercises and translated into the real world, but how much do they actually stick to those lessons as this complexity unfolds. And then ultimately, some mistakes will be made. We should learn from those. We'll come back, change the simulations, get new lessons, adapt to what we have learned, and then begin to start an adaptation cycle where the region sort of adapts to climate, but our management adapts to the lessons that we learn all throughout. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I suspect there will be questions, right?
Okay, so this is our own little Charlie Rose show.
I like it.
I guess my first question is, this is fantastic, and it's so encouraging to see someone working on sort of comprehensive and synthetic solutions as opposed to the fragmented and individual ones which one hears about more often. But I think my first question is a kind of 30,000-foot question. The project, the dynamic modeling project that you just showed us is for Germany. Can you give us a kind of overview about the difference in terms of the contexts of Germany and the United States when it comes to addressing these kinds of issues?
Well, let me back up here for a second. As a matter of fact, when I did this in Germany, I had a similar project in the United States from which we've learned, and that's the key reason why the Germans came to us and said, hey, this is what you're doing. At that point I was at Maryland. That's what you're doing in Maryland. We have similar challenges. Can you translate this? So it was the same question, how can you translate this from one place to another? You can't translate the model and say, oh, now I'm going to plug in the data from another region, but you translate a lot of the knowledge and how to approach this so that the second time you do this for a different region with different constellations and different players, you do this much more efficiently. And so now, obviously, as I talk about the Northwest 2050 project, it's called, from Germany, people in the US and elsewhere in the world ask, oh, how can you sort of cookie cutter, can you take this over here? And no, we can't take it straight over, but we've learned enough and we now know how to do this so that we can, this project was about 20 million US dollars. It was 3 universities, it was tons of people involved, it was 5 years of work. If any of you have 10 million, so I can do it for half, right? I'll do this here, right? So that's one answer. So that's the very basic answer. The other answer is there are some sort of broader issues that drive the perception that we want to do something about climate change, which, it's no big surprise that the Germans wanted to have this done because they have decided since the Fukushima accident that they want to phase out nuclear, right? Which just prior to that made up for about 20% of the energy profile. So suddenly imagine within a few years we would pick your energy carrier, decide that in the US, 20% of this we're not gonna use anymore, right?
Is that what the US is, about 20%?
It's also about in that ballpark. I have to double check the numbers. But so yeah, if we want to just forego 20%, that means everything else gets more expensive, and those that rely on it, might now find challenges in getting what they need when they need it, and so on. So the Germans have recognize that taking away a significant chunk of their energy supply will have major challenges, all while there's another set of challenges unfolding, namely climate change. So people will need more energy for cooling and heating and whatever else it is. The economy continues to grow, so they need more for that. Right. And while you are in that boat, now you're basically taking the fuel away. Right? How do you manage? So they are coming at this out of a certain necessity and urgency that we don't really have here yet. We have almost the opposite, right? We're talking about shale gas and all kinds of other sources of energy that now make us actually a net exporter in areas where historically we've been net importers. Right. And so we find energy, we think we have energy everywhere, right? And so that takes away that urgency, while at the same time it actually increases the carbon emissions, right? And so the mindset is a very different one here.
Right. Well, let me also ask about the audience for this tool. The way you were talking about it in the Northwest project, it sounded like it was government planners, or is that right?
There were planners, but there were about 100 plus people from the private industry. So there, like the pig farmer I mentioned, he was there. There was a person, she was running a poultry operation, very large. She was there. So these are the individual farmers who recognize that if the water's not there, the crop can't grow, the pig can't be fed, and if the biomass is not there to feed the biogenerator, they don't have the electricity for the cooling. So these are people with very clear business interests. Right. They got there. The planners were there. They were the people who deal with supply chain management. There were, the people who operate the electricity grid. So if you take one very stable nuclear power out of the picture and coal plants out of the picture, and you take wind and solar and biomass into the grid, then you have all these suddenly fluctuations that you have to deal with, cycles throughout the course of a day, weeks, months, years. Right? How do you adjust? So we got them all. Right? We didn't. There are a couple of groups we didn't get.
Right. Now I'll just ask one more question on this in this vein, because I don't think I fully have it. This was a project that was done by a consortium of universities. and the funding for it came from the government?
So the German ministry had a competition, basically said, we're concerned about climate change on a regional level.
Right.
Anyone who wants to contribute to our understanding and help shape being prepared, submit a proposal, right? And so there were 10 that ultimately got selected. So just think about that too, 10 times 5, 10 times $20 million, right? This is a serious commitment just to do research and some computer modeling and a little stake of, not what we do here.
Right. Well, that's part of what I wanted to get at, was that the context, one of the things that your interest in policy and my more explicit interest in the built environment have in common is that the context defines the problem as much as we do. The difference between, the degree to which people are in agreement in the general public on the first couple of slides colors the degree to which the respective governments are engaged in this matter in a serious way. We won't get into a political conversation, but it's interesting that the more responsible you are for delivering the goods in whatever area, like for example, the U.S. military is really serious about planning for climate change because they'll really be held accountable if they don't do it right. It seems to me as someone who talks about design and defining the problem, in a way, this issue is itself a design problem. You could think of it as a political problem, but you could also think of it as a design problem. And so the idea of a dashboard or a SimCity-like thing, not necessarily to use as a tool for government action, but actually just to use as a clarifying tool for public discourse, which in a way is the largest problem, it seems to me, in this country.
Yeah, and so this is one of the reasons why I like to show, so for example, when I was in Germany, I showed the US example that we had at that point and then sort of sensitized them. So this was on Maryland, coastal region, agriculture, and so sea level rise was a big issue. So I'm in northern Germany where sea level rise is one of the big issues, and I say, hey, look, here's how we have approached this. Here's another place that's thinking about it. And then you begin to stimulate the thinking about the challenge in a different way from the way in which it was previously conceptualized by those stakeholders, where they in government agencies or individual farmers or anyone in between, suddenly they sort of see this and say, hey, not only does that problem, sort of it resonates, I have something similar that I need to deal with, but wow, there's a way others have approached it and it's somewhat successful, let me figure out what that means. So you start a conversation that previously didn't happen or happened in a very different way. The climate topic is a fairly depressing one, and you suddenly start talking about 100-year time frames, and you're talking about all these bad things that are coming, right? And it's like you're paralyzed. It's like, what are we going to do? And so in some ways, the region felt politically paralyzed. How can we break out of this, right? And so the tool was one way, and the tool is really just a vehicle, right, to get the people to articulate and see the challenges and then work with each other. Right, instead of against each other.
What would you see as, there's so much to talk about this dynamic modeling tool and just the whole idea of being, and the power that I think everybody in here probably sees of being able to look at results of long time frames in real time. In other words, to prototype and test and get on that cycle of design thinking. But what do you see as the next steps in this kind of, I'm not talking really about the data part. I'm talking about, when I was looking at your presentation, I thought, first of all, okay, who's the audience? And I think we've talked a bit about that. But is there visualization, is greater visualization the next step here, so as to make this kind of thing really, so that you empathize with the real audience, which is everyday people, not necessarily the head of the Chamber of Commerce, not necessarily an enlightened pig farmer who has such a big business that he or she really understands that this is going to color them, but the average person. Have you guys thought about that as
Yeah, we have thought about it, and there are different ways this can go. One is well, let me back up here for a second. So this is a tool that you would have a room of people. They see on the screen what's happening. They might debate with each other, and then they come to a conclusion, say, oh, in this county we should have that power plant, or whatever the strategy. The next step might very well be to decentralize this, to have like a computer game that you can play over the web, George, you make your decision on how to crank up your AC when it's hot, and someone else makes a decision on, what power plant to operate and how much to charge for the fuel, whatever it is. So we all make these decisions in an economy simultaneously, right?
And sort of crowdsourced it.
That's basically crowdsource it and then show on the screen what the results are of that game. And as a matter of fact, we're in the process of developing the prototype systems model for urban heat dynamic, or the urban heat island effect it's called. So in a generic way, not tied to a particular city, but tied to what we know about the biogeochemical and social and economic processes. So it's like a synthesized version of the real world, just a hypothetical city. And then the next phase of this will be the gaming environment on top of that, with all the visualization, the gaming interaction piece. And people in the architecture school, arts, media design, are engaged in this, and many others.
Yeah. We've actually worked on a tool that is very much about the public review process, because we were speaking before this event about how taking on these large challenges in the era of participatory democracy is a fundamentally different thing than it was a few hundred years ago, when there was less of this. And I'm not talking about less of the climate issue. I mean, there was less democracy. And so you look at cities, and we often marvel at the beauty of a Paris or Washington, D.C. or something like that, and we forget that they didn't have to persuade whole bunches of people and cajole in order to execute a plan. It was a very centralized enterprise, which meant that whatever the leading idea of the day was could be implemented, to get to your sixth point in our ideation thing, where you include implementation. It's not so now, or it is significantly less so now. And so the biggest problem to be solved may very well be this one about public communication. And so we developed a tool, actually a colleague, Terrence Masson, developed a tool to help you as an average citizen walking down the street in your neighborhood to visualize a proposed large development project and to be able to comment on it, but in specific categories. In other words, informed by the researchers, but that allowed participation at a public level. This, I'm just trying to get at this space between expertise on the one hand, leaders and governments and expertise, and citizens on the other. It's the space in between there that we have to, it seems to me, develop.
Absolutely, and so that means, first of all, we need to develop the skills so that, science education broadly defined, right? That needs to be there. So if you're still running into people who have an issue accepting that climate change is happening, we didn't really do such a great job in science, right? So there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be laid there. But then ultimately, carrying out the scientific enterprise in the way that it resonates with these end-use communities is a real challenge for many of the scientists. Most of us, haven't been trained in how to do this, right? And as a matter of fact, there is a stigma in sort of the sciences. The closer you get to the stakeholders, the less objective it is, right? And so as a matter of fact, in this and several other projects I've led, we had the team of researchers, we had the stakeholders, and then we had a research advisory committee that basically looked the researchers over the shoulder, make sure, hey, so that you guys don't get too skewed in your approaches by the special interests of the stakeholder groups. And then we had a stakeholder advisory committee that basically made sure that the stakeholder group really represented a cross-section of the people that you should have there, and that the ones who are there actually spoke out when they were supposed to and didn't just hold back, or that the same people who always spoke out once in a while piped down a little, so that you have, and so this was really tricky, right? And a lot of time people say that they get science fatigue, right? It's just like another report, another study to respond to. But I can tell you, we sometimes got stakeholder fatigue, right? It's really hard to do this, for a few years in a row and keep them engaged and, keep them be part of this. So there is that. But I also think that ultimately, yes, you could wish for some benevolent dictator to come in and solve the problem for you. We've tried this historically a few times. We can point at incidences where it worked well, but by and large, the track record is not so good. So it's a good time to start thinking about alternative models, alternative models of democracy. And the real challenge there is that the problem you're trying to solve unfolds at such a speed that might be larger than the speed at which you can put in place the solution mechanism, right? And so we've got to ramp that up a little, right? And we should also be prepared to make the odd mistake and learn from it, right? So that we get better at the democracy and participatory decision-making process than we currently are good at.
Well, it does seem to me that the greatest opportunity for us is in the sort of visualization, public education space, especially in the age of the web, where everyone has access at least to more, or very large portion of the population has access to higher level communication tools than ever.
Oh yeah, I can tell you. I contributed to the final report for this. I never read the full final report, right? I shouldn't admit this, but
this is being taped, by the way.
I know.
It will be used against you in a court of law.
That's fine. That's fine. I'm tenured, so there you go. But my point is that there are modes of communicating scientific and all kinds of other knowledge that are just much more effective than the way we're doing it, right? And so if the science community that creates a lot of these new ways actually lives what they preach sort of collectively, right? If we are engaging in these new opportunities, then that bridge between science and society, hopefully gets also a little stronger, or the two of them move closer together.
Another way that what you do and what I do is related, I think, both kinds of work, urban design, policy, shine a bright light on the distinction between costs and benefits at the local versus the regional scale, or international for that matter. But, the misalignment, and this is kind of an economics issue, I guess, but the misalignment of costs versus benefits is kind of common theme, whether you're talking about acid rain 30 years ago, or whether you're talking about warming today. In other words, I'm not necessarily paying for the benefits that I'm getting in terms of the long-term cost to all of us. And carbon tax or carbon trading is certainly one of the things that has been put out as a way of attempting to reconcile this asymmetry. I wonder if you have anything to... I know is that just huge?
How much time do we have? No,
okay.
This is great. So let me just, so you can probably tell from my accent. I'm originally from Germany, so I grew up there. 25 years ago I left. But just as one little aside, so we're talking here about carbon taxes. No one likes taxes. Don't get me wrong. The Germans don't like taxes either, right? No one likes taxes. As soon as you start talking in this country about taxes, everyone's against it. We're already heavily taxed. The German word for tax is called Steuer, which means to direct or to guide, right? They don't necessarily like it, but it's instead of just thinking of it as a drain on your pocketbook that you're taxing the resources, the money away from people, it's the notion that you're reallocating to guide and direct in a more desirable way. So there are these deep, coming back to a question you asked, there are actually some not just organized, how society is organized, but there's some deeper cultural and philosophical bases on which these discussions are played out. When it comes to climate mitigation, so cutting the emissions, the argument often is made, and I actually think, and I can, if we have time, we can talk about this why, but I think it's actually a faulty argument. The argument is made that taxing, raises costs and it, imposes a damage in some form or another to someone, and then the benefits are diffuse across the globe or for future generations. You never really reap them in. But when it comes to climate adaptation, you build your house that's more flood-proof or more energy efficient, or you retreat from the coastline and maintain the ecosystems, enjoy them for their scenic beauty, enjoy them for fishing and hunting, enjoy them for tourism, enjoy them for flood control, because these wetlands are way better than most of the other things we can put in place. You have paid the cost, but you also, as a city, as an individual, have the immediate benefit, right, within a few years, right? And so it's actually also in that sense that much of my research in the last 20 years has moved away from the mitigation story to the adaptation story, because it immediately benefits those who also bear the costs, and it's much easier to mobilize. Having said all of this, there's a big problem if we, like I just did, separate mitigation and adaptation so much. You can do great mitigation at the same time at which you do adaptation. So, for example, if you use local resources more efficiently, the local forests and the local grasslands or whatever, to create the biomass, to decentralize your power grid, then you typically cut down on the carbon emissions, and so you have the mitigation benefit, right? But also, you now have an electricity grid that's more decentralized and less susceptible to large-scale power outages because of some extreme weather event, right? And so you have an adaptation benefit while you have the mitigation benefit. And it's actually one of those cases where you can spend the buck once and get the bang twice, right? And that's cool. And if we can focus on some of those, I think we're in a really good situation. The last point on this is, and I mentioned this at the end of my talk, this is, this climate debate can potentially be depressing, and we've sort of played it out as damages and costs and risks and harms and vulnerability. But you could also, if we were really living what we're preaching, you could also think of this as a business opportunity. Where are the great entrepreneurs who say, hey, the need for better cooling, the need for better heating, the need for better flood control, the need for better emergency response systems. There's a business opportunity. If we figure this out for this country now, imagine the Vietnams and the Bangladeshis and the Chinas and the whoever else in the world 10, 15 years down the road. I mean, we're not doing it, right? And we should.
Well, that is the part that I find most confusing in a way. We spoke in my office before coming over here about the reluctance to raise the gas mileage standards on cars until very recently and prior to the Obama administration. And I never understood this, because if you could produce, and of course surely we can, we have the capacity to do it, if we could regulate our way to producing these better quality things that would be desirable everywhere, well, one can extrapolate from cars to all kinds of other things, and be leaders in those areas rather than reluctant sort of followers.
Absolutely true. There's only one not so small problem, and I'm so with you on this.
Yeah.
So what if your car is 20% more efficient and your house is 20% more efficient, and whatever else you consume in terms of energy and materials is, let's say, 20% more efficient? By and large, you spend less money on the materials and the energy, right? Because you get more out of what you buy. So you have roughly a 20% real income increase.
Right.
What are you going to use it for? You're going to fly somewhere to the Caribbean and have a long vacation, or right?
Yeah.
So there is that. So it's sometimes referred to as the rebound effect, right? That we take these savings that then actually translate into real money savings,
right.
And then they find their outlet somewhere else that's material and energy intensive.
Right.
And so to address that really requires a bit of a rethinking of what it is that makes us actually feel better off. Is it the stuff?
Right.
Or is it maybe now cutting 20% back on your work week? Or, and then spend the time clean up the local stream in your community, or do some volunteering on the public school, or whatever it is. But we're not really thinking like that. We're thinking efficiency, and then the problems are solved.
Right.
And then the efficiency gives us that gain, where we fall back in the old patterns of consumption, while we're all stressed and can't get our work done, and crank up the emissions, and then have to deal with the outfall from that. So there is sort of a broader structural challenge.
That's very interesting, actually. you're right, we don't usually talk about those things together. We might talk about, let's say, at one end of the spectrum, let's say the ethical issues associated with, let's say, not paying attention to climate change. But it is interesting to think about the everything from the sort of psychological to the political philosophy consequences of reimagining what private happiness is in a public system, and that's that's a tall order for. I mean, we're already. I had some notes here that I think are, we haven't talked about the. When you showed us the outline or the diagram of your model, I thought, oh my God, that is the most complicated. I appreciate the need to address all those interconnected variables, but my brain explodes at the prospect of trying to link them in a continuous chain of reasoning. And the slide I'm talking about that has the giant middle that has population, housing, energy, food, land use, infrastructure, and shipping. And yes, I totally get that all those things are connected. But then if you add, human happiness, lack of stress, and so forth, this is we're heading towards a universal theory of everything.
Yeah, but let's go one step at a time, right?
Yes.
So I'm not sure we're heading towards that, but from my perspective, and this is sort of the systems thinking piece, right? So there are two answers to your question or comment. One is these interrelationships, the recognition that they're important really comes out of sort of a systems thinking perspective, right?
Sure.
Many of these problems cannot be solved on a piecemeal basis. You really got to step back and see if you do something here, what does it require there, and vice versa, right? And then once you've done this middle piece, if you wish, then you recognize, there are these longer term dynamics on the socioeconomic side, for example, how societies perceive of what creates wealth, what's the work week look like, what's the consumption patterns look. Those are the things that we actually try to get at with these worldviews. So you basically take the same philosophy. First you talked about technologies and how they interrelate. Now you sort of figured that out, and I would say, hey, how does that all relate to the performance of the region? And then this is sort of the nested system. The region is actually part of a larger social fabric, which is then part of a larger, in the case of that region, larger part of Germany, which is part of the European Union. So you begin to sort of think about not just solving the problem inside one of these hierarchies across these nested systems, but also think about what needs to happen in the other layers that either constrain or give opportunity to it.
Right.
Yeah, and that's a cool intellectual exercise at a minimum, and it's totally mind-boggling most of the time. And if you want to learn that dynamic modeling, there's a course that's being offered here on campus. But many of the other things, you learn at places like architecture schools or policy schools or engineering, where you're dealing with systems, really, with people and the artifacts that they create and how they relate to each other.
Right. Well, it does seem that this, your dynamic model of the Northwest in Germany is an example of one, but it does seem like with the great computational power that we have now and the incredible connectedness and live data streams that we can feed into these things, the idea of creating multidisciplinary models, or I don't know what the right word is, multi-issue or models that address multiple variables that can have content added to them over time in a way seems like maybe the way to approach this, as opposed to try to build a new machine for every issue. Maybe build the interdependence into a model, and then you can inject different variables. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's exactly how we start these projects, right? So we start with some nucleus, for example, trying to understand how power plants work and when they get retired and what the fuel use is and so on. But then we back up. We have a whole group of people who deal with consumption profiles of households and the associated demographic change. So if people get older, how does it change their behaviors, their demands for house space, basically, for products, for whatever. And then if there's immigration or emigration, how does that change and then whom you live next to has an impact. So they get at this from the consumer, social, behavioral, psychological perspective, and can distill relationships that are really important and interesting to know, and then we begin to quantify those in the model. So we work with them, and Actually, the software, there are 4 symbols that you need to use and connect them up with each. It's totally easy. I mean, the software language is taught in K through 12 education. I mean, you can use this, right? And so the non-modelers can come in with their expertise and describe what they see, how they see the relationships and how those unfold. And then in that dialogue, you can wire up the consumer profile, if you wish, and its evolution. Right? And then you stick it in sort of like a little Lego block on top of the other Legos that have these knobs coming out, and you know where which knob goes, and then that creates, an ever more hopefully realistic or meaningful tool for them to everyone see their small part of the world, but then also see how it relates to the rest. And it's the technique, it's the software, and then there's the art, and the art is partially sort of knowing what needs to go where and having done it for a while and being able to communicate across these interdisciplinary boundaries, right? So you got to be able to talk to the engineer one day, and you got to talk to the psychologist the next day, and the business planner, and figure out how, what the commonalities are and how to put this together.
Yeah. That you can send questions to the hashtag understanding design, or you can come up and ask them at the microphone. So please get ready to do that. But I wanted to just say, I think that, when the more talking to you about this enterprise, this sort of modeling, this sort of trying to get people to first understand this large climate issue, and second, try to help give them some steps that they can take in acting on it. It's really clear to me how policy is the glue that connects so many areas of expertise that people find at a university with the world that they actually live in. Because it's sometimes maybe for our students, they aren't as aware, perhaps as we are, how segregated from implementation much of what goes on in a university is. Do you know what I mean? And policy is kind of the conduit through which developments in science and design and everything make it to public life. Because without policy, it oftentimes isn't going to happen by itself.
No, that's absolutely right. And what we often do is in the sciences, and I was trained as an economist, and oftentimes you do the analysis, and then in the last paragraph you say, now you've done all the math and all the data stuff and so on. Last paragraph you say, it's of policy relevance, right? It's like, go guys, figure out what to do with it, right? And I got a little tired I've played that game, I thought it's actually disingenuous, right? It's like, I'm not the one who can say that this is relevant. The people out there, someone out there who needs to make decisions, they can say whether this is relevant or not, right? It's not me who's the judge. And so how do you actually figure out what is relevant to them or not, right? So you got to figure out what the challenges are that they are facing. You got to begin to articulate your science in a way that resonates with their language, with their worldviews, right? And as you do this, you begin to learn from them. You can get access to data that you never even knew existed, and then you can bring this back to your research. So it's the use-inspired research model, right? And the policy schools of this world, and the one on this campus in particular, are really plugged into being that conduit between the research and the application. But that in itself doesn't mean you're just sort of a delivery mechanism. No, it takes a lot of research to actually make that happen too, right? And so it's then a seamless integration, ideally, between those. And there are lots of ways in which just as a little plug here, lots of ways in which to do this, and new technologies really are helping exactly with that. So we have a new master's program in urban informatics, where you take some of that high-end computing skills and techniques and bring them to bear on how a city works and improve it.
This is David Lazar and...
Well, it's the policy school that's running this, yes. So there's a data science certificate and undergraduate that goes with it. Dietmar Huber, Dan O'Brien, James Connolly, these are some of the names.
Well, one thing that I think, I said it before, but I think that kind of work will really benefit from. I mean, if you asked me what is the next level problem to be solved in this kind of modeling, even with an extremely superficial understanding of what you're doing, it is, in the same way that one of the more effective tools for communicating climate issues were those time-lapse maps that showed what was going to be dry land and what was going to be wet over 5 years, 10 years, 50, 100 years, because that allowed people, that was taking the data and then putting it in a form for people to comprehend. It seems to me ever more focus on that kind of empathetic communication is definitely going to be a winning hand, because if people can continue to not imagine themselves in this conversation, it's just not going to be successful.
Yeah, and if they're the recipient of yet another depressing news story or yet another tax to be imposed on them, I mean, how do you get them to be motivated to do something, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, being really engaged and being able to visualize what this all means and then finding the solutions to the problem, I mean, that's exactly the state we need to get to.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, do we have some questions, Kate? And do we have questions from the audience? So you can feel free to come up to the mic as well.
So it says the graphs of global temperature appear to go only to the year 2000. How does the data compare over the past 14 years?
Oh, that's a really good question. And so actually I took this very basic chart from the so-called IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is this international conglomerate of some of the best scientists in the world coming together and condensing that information and publicizing it. And so this was the publication from 2007, so the most reliable data extended only to until 2000. The new data, if nothing else, is actually even more pronounced upward trend. People are talking about a hockey stick when it comes to both the carbon concentrations in the atmosphere and the associated temperature increase. It's sort of a little flat and then just going way up. And so, yeah, out of the last 12 years, 10 were heat record years around the globe. And drought and what's happening now in Arizona and New Mexico, the flooding, it's all consistent with an ever more increasingly severe and frequent weather extreme characterized sort of climate conditions. So it's not going to get better for quite a while, so we need to adjust to that. So, but yes, the long and short of it is you only saw this first part of a trend that just continued.
Oh, here we go. Here, Kate, we've got somebody.
Hi. You spoke about how, from a design perspective, Germany's decision to eliminate nuclear power presented new challenges, and I'm wondering if you feel that was a rational decision, or if maybe they were over-empathizing with the plight of the people in Japan, and if that was maybe a little bit more of a decision based on sensationalism, or if you think it was a rational choice.
Oh, that's a really good question. You know what? I can't really judge so much the motivation that ultimately lay behind this, but I think it was, the event in Japan was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, there are long discussions that go back to the 70s in Germany whether nuclear is the right way to go. And if you put it in a broader context, it also has to do with the fact that this is a country that started 2 world wars, right, and now suddenly has nuclear power. And so there are all these political undercurrents behind the energy and climate debate. But then ultimately, what won in the argument, if you wish, was to say, hey, like the fossil fuels, with nuclear, we are basically accumulating a problem that we haven't really figured out yet how to deal with, right? Let's make a drastic change. And if we do this now, sooner or later, all the others, or most of the others, will have to do it also, but we'll have a first mover advantage. We'll have the technologies in place, and we have the markets developed, and we have the skill levels built up in our workforce, and then we can roll out, even though it costs us now a lot, we can roll out on a really large scale some of these alternatives. And if you look at photovoltaic industry, for example, a lot of this was spurred by government action in Germany. It's now the largest per capita solar power generator in the world, and most of this is north of Toronto. right? How have they done this? They've just heavily invested through government subsidies and very creative tariff systems. So if you put a solar collector on your roof, some of the time you need the energy yourself, some of the time you don't need it, you feed it back into the grid. You actually get more money from the grid feed-in than when you buy it from the grid. So yeah, it makes perfect sense to put it up. But it helped the government not to buy any or build any more new power plants, right? So this was a little scheme that totally took off and it's now being mirrored all around the world, which wasn't a technology innovation, it was a regulatory policy innovation. That spurred the industry, and then they became the world's leaders on PV photovoltaic cells that are being built and distributed. And now that industry is actually on its way out. Now they are building the technology to help the Chinese to make it more efficient, right? And so being ahead of the curve was really, to a very large extent, the motivator behind this. Did they overreact in the moment? Maybe they did, but there's this cultural context, and then there's this sort of attitude looking into the future where the market's actually going to be.
I would say that's the most important distinction is that idea of, I mean, we were talking before, we send students to Berlin every semester, and one of the reasons is that Germany is like the home of the sustainable building technology movement, and all of it, almost all of it started there. And that was sponsored entirely by regulatory change. And as a result, now today, the new buildings in Germany are almost unrecognizable to American eyes. They're better in every respect. I mean, they're more energy efficient. People in them get more access to natural light. They have more air changes. They're required to have more air changes per hour and so forth. Everything about them is improved for a human's experience of them. And all of that is simply by raising the bar for everybody. In other words, you're not relying on one really enlightened developer, which we do here. Occasionally somebody might say, well, I'm willing to spend a whole bunch of money that none of my competitors are spending in order to make building X. Very unlikely, however, in a competitive economic market. Whereas when the regulators change the rules for everybody, it's everything.
So I have two quick additional, so this is a great question, thanks. Two quick additional comments. So the first one, very brief. I would not want to see the Germans sort of put on a higher pedestal than many others. Yes, they have figured out a lot of stuff, but they are also to come back to my rebound argument, they're also the world champions when it comes to long distance flying, right? The long vacation in the Fijis and so. So yes, they do take what they save there, right? So there's that. So, but that aside, so when you guys buy a car, should you ever buy a car, it's by law, it's required that the manufacturer tells you what the fuel economy is, right? So what if, before you buy a house or rent an apartment, they have to certify how energy efficient your building is, right? That in itself, just that information disclosure makes you recognize, oh, these guys have the old appliances in there, yeah, it might be a cheaper rent, but I'm going to pay much more every month because they've never upgraded and they don't have insulation in the attic or whatever it might be. And so yes, in England and many other countries in Europe, they have now implemented rating systems where when you buy a house, that has to be disclosed to you how it performed on the energy efficiency front. And that helped change to some extent the choices that consumers make.
Right.
Sometimes you don't have the choice. If you want to be in a particular neighborhood, and they're all being built in the same time, they all more or less perform the same way. But
Good. Yeah, Kate, do we have another?
How is the accuracy of regional simulations affected by decisions made by other locations?
Oh, very good question. So this is the boundary constraint argument. So how is what we model for inside the system affected by what's happening outside? Be it climate or be it the socioeconomics and so on. Of course, it is a lot, and so we can't model the whole world, right? So we chose to just model that region and then get at these dynamics of the whole world through these framing scenarios. And we said, well, what if the rest of the world just sort of regionally disaggregated and everyone did what they could best? What would that mean for us? What if it were, totally non-stop globalization. So through these three framing scenarios, I have sort of one in between the two extremes. Through these three framing scenarios, we have sort of spelled out a consistent way in which the outside influences might constrain or create opportunities for the region. But yeah, it's all somewhere you have to draw the boundaries.
Right. Other questions? Okay. Matthias, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity.